Adelaide took a deep breath and prepared herself for the next applicant. But before Mrs. Giggs could even call out the name, a commotion erupted in the waiting room. All eyes turned towards the entrance, and even Mrs. Giggs looked puzzled. A man in a sleek black suit had entered, drawing everyone's attention. His jet black hair and piercing blue eyes caught the light, and the badge on his chest, featuring crossed swords and a black panther, demanded respect. Mrs. Giggs greeted him respectfully, addressing him as Sir Lionel Balder. He's applying. Is that really Lionel Balder? Could it be true? Does he really want to be an aide? Who knew Lionel Balder would show up for the interviews? But Lionel remained an enigma. His striking appearance, the air of mystery surrounding him, and the Balder family badge on his chest left no doubt in anyone's mind that he was the real Lionel Balder. The tension in the room heightened as everyone waited with bated breath to see what would unfold. I don't know if it's too late, Lionel said in a respectful tone as he handed over his application without any questions. We'll need you to wait a moment, Mrs. Giggs informed him, and Lionel complied, taking a seat on the sofa in the waiting room. In the waiting room, the commotion went unnoticed by her, but Adele, who was in charge of interviewing the applicants, sensed a subtle change in their attitudes. They seemed either bewildered or unmotivated, unlike the previous ones, making it hard to explain. Adele rubbed her chin and tilted her head, trying to make sense of the situation. Eventually, the tedious interviews ended, and Adele muttered that she had a hard time buying all the applicants' attitudes before burying herself deep in her chair. Just when she thought it was over, Mrs. Giggs rushed in with a stiff piece of paper in her hand. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. There is only one applicant left, she said, handing over the paper. Adelaide's gaze went through the documents at breakneck speed, but it stopped abruptly. Should we ask for the last applicant? She asked, looking up with her golden eyes glistening like a cold-blooded beast. Adelaide sat on an ornate chair, her eyes fixed on the open door. She looked up when Lionel entered and met his gaze with an intense stare. Lionel felt like he was facing a predator, but he maintained his composure and greeted her politely. Hello, Your Majesty, he said. Lionel Balder. She called out his name in a deep bass voice and gestured for him to sit down. Adele didn't offer any tea, and Lionel didn't expect her to. The other applicants were treated similarly. Adelaide stared at him, waiting for him to speak. He knew she wasn't interested in small talk or entertainment. She wanted someone who could bring something to the table, and he was convinced he was the right person for the job. He discarded his prepared remarks and got straight to the point, showing her his cold rationality. Are you trying to balance the forces? She countered, her tone sharp. Lionel did not waver. Aren't you looking for an aide to join hands with reliable power in this place where there is nowhere to lean on, and to defend your power and honor against someone who has already occupied the palace? Whoever you choose will be a worse choice than if you chose me. He spoke matter-of-factly, without a hint of bravado or conceit. The Empress's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Look, sir. No, should I call you Minister? She said, her tone playful. You can call me whatever you feel comfortable with, Lionel replied. Anyway, you really want to be my aide right now, you mean? That's right. Why? The Empress narrowed her eyes, sizing him up. It's been a while since I came here, so I can't read the situation perfectly, but even so, it doesn't seem like there are any benefits to be gained from having Balder's direct line become my aide. You could have recruited a vassal family or a person from another family whose interests matched and sent it to you as a candidate, but why did you bother to come in person? She continued. Lionel did not hesitate. It's because Her Majesty wants information about the tower she knows. The Empress's interest was piqued. About the tower, she repeated. That's right, Lionel confirmed, his gaze unwavering. Do you believe that the knowledge of the tower outweighs the cost of becoming an Empress's aide? Adele inquired, her hand resting thoughtfully on her chin. Lionel replied without hesitation, "Indeed, I do. Did I mention that I may call you whatever name I feel comfortable with?" She queried suddenly, breaking the silence. Lionel appeared momentarily confused before nodding in affirmation. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Lionel," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "I am seeking an aid to bolster my prestige and stand against certain factions within the Imperial Palace." "You were correct in your assessment. However, the aid I choose must also pretend to be my lover. Do you understand this? If someone from Baldur's family should present themselves, they will be selected without question," Lionel thought. Adele was well aware of the precarious position he occupied as a direct descendant of a noble family. "I will have to call you by your name and speak formally with you, that way we'd look like lovers in their eyes. If you're still fine with that, then I'll appoint you as my aide." "Of course," he replied, "I am fine with that. If they think of us as lovers, please appoint your aide, Your Majesty." At this point, Adele's body, weary from 3 days of interviews, felt as light as a feather. She thought, "Looks like I've found an aide who's really to my liking." "Who applied?" the Emperor demanded, his voice low and commanding. After a long pause, the servant finally spoke again. "Sir Lionel Baldur has responded," the servant replied, his voice shaking. The Emperor's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. "To the position of the Empress Mistress?" he asked sharply. The servant hesitated for a moment before nodding hesitantly. "Yes, Your Highness," he replied. "But I don't know if he's been chosen. The Empress hasn't made an official announcement." The Emperor's expression darkened, and a sense of unease washed over him. Dismissing the servant with a wave of his hand, he made his way out to the terrace, his mind consumed with worry. As he stood there, staring out at the moonlit night, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He had always preferred the darkness to the light, the cold to the heat, he thought. The mysterious sweet scent of Adele still lingers on my nose. The day the Empress came to me, if I had accepted her invitation, drunk on her scent, I'm sure I would have sent Diana away and spent the night with her. How will the noble-blooded woman, who is set to be a ruler, become unsettled, and how will her prideful eyes, which look down on me, become agitated? If it happens, I wouldn't have missed even a second, as if it's engraved in my mind, simply being there, simply existing. Is it that challenging? What's so bad about being the quill of a quill pen or a vase holding the flowers? Isn't that a life? How should I tame a beast that shows its teeth and claws?" He muttered to himself, his voice low and fierce. "I will have to pull out all the teeth and claws." But as he spoke the words, he couldn't help but wonder if he was doing the right thing. After Lionel departed, Adele savored a light dinner before slipping into the soothing embrace of hot water. As the warmth seeped into her limbs, turning them ghostly pale and lulling her into delicious dizziness, she surrendered to the languid pleasure of the moment, basking in the haze of her own thoughts. There was no better balm for her weary soul than this, and so she lay there, content to remain in the water until her consciousness inevitably faded away. She was only roused from her peaceful reverie when her skin broke out in a fine sheen of sweat, signaling that she had been in the bath far longer than she intended. Suddenly, the bathroom door creaked open, and Mrs. Giggs appeared in her usual unflappable manner. "Ah, I was just about to leave anyway," Adele murmured, offering a small smile in gratitude to the loyal old lady. "Yes, Your Majesty," Mrs. Giggs replied with a nod. "I think you should." Mrs. Giggs continued, "His Majesty the Emperor has arrived." She hastily reached for her gown and allowed Mrs. Giggs to wrap it around her shoulders, her wet hair dripping onto the floor. "What should I do?" Adele asked, suddenly feeling uncharacteristically unsure. To her relief, Mrs. Giggs remained unfazed. "As always, Your Majesty's wishes are my top priority," she replied, stepping aside to let Adele make her own decision. Adele said. Seems like he has come to ask something regarding Lionel Valdier's visit. Shouldn't at least hear what he wants to ask me. Carl was waiting for her in the drawing room attached to her bedroom, his stern features softened slightly by the sight of her in her light home dress. Adele took a seat across from him on the sofa, unable to shake the feeling that this was all some kind of game. It was a sudden visit, so it took some time to prepare. It's because you caught me in the bath, she said by way of greeting, hoping to lighten the mood. What is it, Your Majesty the Emperor? Adele asked, her voice devoid of any emotion. Carl wasted no time beating around the bush. Who will you appoint as your aide? Adele suppressed a laugh at the Emperor's brusqueness, his gaze lingering on it for a moment too long. Well, Adele began. By the way, Your Majesty, she let her words trail off, watching as Carl's eyes snapped back to hers. Should I report it to you? Carl merely grunted again, his impatience palpable. Who will you choose? Adele leaned back against the sofa, allowing a small smile to cross her lips. If this was a game, she was determined. Carl's demeanor remained unchanged as Adele directed her sneer at the Emperor, who once again attempted to coerce her into compliance with a shameless and callous expression. Did Your Majesty obtain my permission? Whomever you may choose, it is my heart that is at stake. Do not ask, Adele asserted. Shall I choose Lionel Balder? The Emperor inquired, openly mentioning the name of the potential candidate. Adele's eyes narrowed at the mention, and she shot back, so what? Is there an issue with that? Choose someone else, the Emperor commanded. Why? Adele questioned, refusing to back down. Princess Balder and her ilk are enemies of the imperial family. Would you accept such a person as your aide? There is a limit to how far I will tolerate your disobedience. Fulfill your of husband and wife duty accordingly, the Emperor replied coldly. Adele felt her blood boil at the Emperor's words. She was not a person who could be treated so callously, she thought how shameless he is. And she used same words that Emperor spoke to her. Just like a feather on a quill or a flower in a vase. Do you want me to live like that? She asked the Empress, her voice echoing with the sincerity of her question. Why do you ask all of a sudden? The Emperor responded, surprised by Adele's sudden outburst. Because it matters. I ask again. Do you want me to live like that? Adele repeated, determined to make her point clear. The Emperor smiled. He was unyielding, resolved to keep a tight leash on Adele as if she were a wild animal in need of taming. Exactly, he stated firmly. I am not a mere accessory, a passive being who accepts everything without expressing my opinion. You want me to be a comfortable partner who comes and goes, but that is not who I am, Adele declared, her words sharp and resolute. For a moment, the Emperor was silent, taken aback by Adele's unwavering spirit. Finally, the Emperor spoke. His will as firm as ever. Okay, I want just that much, he said, his gaze unyielding. Adele took a sip of her tea, the bitterness on her tongue and the dryness of her lips mirroring the bitterness and frustration she felt within. Whom shall you choose? Adele's companion prodded, their words hanging heavy in the air. A moment passed before Adele answered, her voice smooth as silk. Lionel Balder. I would choose him, she whispered with a seductive smile. The response elicited a gasp from her companion, who addressed her as Empress. In shock. Undeterred, Adele continued, pay no attention to my women, and I will not pay attention to your lover either, she repeated. Emperor, same words. She reclined leisurely on the sofa, unperturbed by the tension in the room. This is what His Majesty said. Did you forget? She asked, her voice laced with a hint of amusement. How many times have you seen a lover? Aren't you just protesting against me? Carl challenged her, his voice sharp with irritation. Adele's lips curled into a sly smile, revealing her pearly white teeth. What do you need to look at for a long time? You can come in at a glance, she replied, her gaze fixed on him. As the tension between them grew thicker, Karl's expression turned dangerous. Won't you regret it? He asked, his voice low and menacing. Adele did not flinch. Your Majesty, won't you regret it? She countered, her eyes sparkling with fierce determination. He continued, I warned you to be aware of your position. She replied, I don't plan on becoming an added accessory. You told me to fulfill my duty, didn't you? But, shouldn't you first acknowledge me as a spouse on equal footing? Their gazes locked, and the air between them crackled with tension. With a heavy heart, Karl rose from her seat and made her way out of the room with rough steps. As she reached the door, Karl turned back and gave one last warning to Adele. Think wisely, Empress. Don't regret later, she said, her voice heavy with meaning. The words lingered in the room long after Karl had gone. Adele shook her head, her smile turning grim. Think wisely, Adele. Don't regret it belatedly, she murmured to herself. As she contemplated her situation, Adele couldn't help but think of her mother. She wondered if it was just a coincidence that she always seemed to encounter people like Karl, or if it was because those were the only kinds of people who made it to the top. She knew she needed wisdom, but she had no idea where to find it. With a forceful hand, Karl flung open the door. By his side stood Mrs. Giggs, who lowered her head in reverence. Karl, who had been poised to ignore the presence of the maids and proceed on her way, abruptly halted in front of Mrs. Giggs. Is it a person or a position that you are loyal to? He inquired. Your Majesty, the Emperor, Mrs. Giggs replied, her head still bowed. Head. He leaned in and whispered in her ear, I, born to a lowly handmaiden, must be cherished to become an emperor. Do you think I took Princess Elizabeth's place merely because I was born as a man? It's not like that, she replied. He continued, such a lie, I know everything, that's why I'm surprised. When the Empress summoned you, I thought you wouldn't come. Why? Because she's my Empress, but you did you, Mrs. Giggs closed her eyes at Karl's contemptuous words and let out a soft sigh. He continued, tell the Empress this, then, in order to thrive in my empire and my palace, she must be in good standing with the owner of this place. That way, you two can be by the Empress's side, right? Isn't that right, Nanny? Mrs. Giggs remained silent. Your Majesty the Empress, Mrs. Giggs said. If you have something to say, say it. I am listening, the Empress replied without opening her eyes. Mrs. Giggs hesitated for a moment before speaking, carefully choosing her words. I was the general manager of the Imperial Palace appointed by Her Majesty, the previous Empress, and the nanny of Her Highness the Grand Duke. I know, the Empress replied, still with her eyes closed. I took care of one more baby at the same time. It was unofficial, and very few people know about it, Mrs. Giggs continued. The Empress opened her eyes slightly, intrigued. Go on, she said. I was also the nanny of His Majesty the present Emperor, Mrs. Giggs revealed, causing Adele's eyes to widen in surprise. Why are you saying that now? The Empress asked. Deep in his heart is a child who has not yet grown up, Mrs. Giggs said softly. A child who desperately wanted to be loved but never received it, who crouched after receiving a twisted love rather than a correct love. Scene shifts. As the Emperor stormed out of the Empress Palace, he arrived unannounced at Diane's quarters. Upon hearing the news, Diane hastily jumped out of bed and made her way to the Emperor. To her, he looked like a beautiful but dangerously poisonous flower amidst the darkness of the night. Karl stared blankly at the scene unfolding before him. As Diane approached, she carefully studied Karl's expression, sensing that the Emperor must have been very upset about something. Your Majesty, was he displeased by the Empress? Diane asked in a soft voice, to which the Emperor remained silent and simply looked at her with an enigmatic expression. Sensing his discontentment, Diane wondered if it was because of the Empress's aid problem. How could she hire an aide over His Majesty? I really don't get it, she whispered, hoping to placate him. But the Emperor remained silent, fixated on the nape of her neck. Suddenly, he buried his face in her neck and took a deep breath, as if savoring her scent. Diane was startled but managed to call out to him in confusion. After a moment, the Emperor raised his head, his brow furrowing slightly as he studied her face. "Why are you like that?" she asked in a sudden burst of emotion. Suddenly, Carl spoke in a soft and measured voice, like a feather on a quill, like a flower in a vase. "Live like that." The words were cryptic and disjointed, leaving Diane to blink a few times in confusion. After a moment's pause, she flashed a warm smile and replied, "It must be a comfortable life, that is." Diane's eyes sparkled with love and contentment as she squeezed Carl's hands and asked, "When I become a feather in a quill, will you use it, Your Majesty? Will you put the vase next to you when it becomes a flower in a vase?" She tilted her head coyly, reveling in the sensation of being adored like a treasured gift. Carl's heart fluttered in response to Diane's affectionate words. He felt a sudden urge to seize the nape of her neck and draw her close, like a magnificent and wild creature taming its prey. As Diane looked up at him with playful eyes, he reached out and encircled her slender neck with his hand. Holding her like a leash, he pressed his thumb against her lips, feeling the softness of her mouth give way to his touch. As he squeezed her lips, he imagined them as fragile flower petals, crushed and molded to his will. Diane parted her lips and lightly nibbled on his thumb, savoring the heady sensation of being under Carl's spell. "The eyes will be blurred, turning red and cloudy," the Emperor warned. But the subsequent actions of the monarch were a far cry from what Diane had anticipated. Without warning, the Emperor abruptly withdrew his hand, leaving Diane's eyes to widen in surprise. His fingertips were slick with moisture, much like her own luscious, glistening lips. "Your Majesty?" she inquired, her voice soft and tinged with regret and doubt. The Emperor, however, ignored her thin voice and turned away from her, his demeanor cold and aloof. He stormed out of the room without a word, leaving behind no trace of lingering emotion, as if he had been summoned by something urgent. At the sight of his swift departure, Diane's heart began to flutter ominously. "I'm not someone who can be denied. He never ignore my seduction. What is this now?" Diane's eyes shook violently as she tried to make sense of the perplexing encounter with her beloved Emperor. The tale of Mrs. Giggs had unfolded over an extended period, her struggles as the late Empress leaving her in a state of constant distress. But the pinnacle of her anguish was reached when her lady-in-waiting, Yi, bore the Emperor a son. The Emperor declared the child the Empress's adopted son and heir, a decision that neither the former Empress, who could not bear children, nor the birth mother could accept with ease. The child, separated from its biological mother, was raised in the palace, much to the chagrin of the former Empress. At 6 years old, the child learned that the mother she thought was hers was actually a stepmother who despised her deeply, while her true mother was half-mad and insane by the time she visited at age 7. Such a twisted upbringing was bound to leave its mark. Mrs. Giggs had shared this story with Adele, hoping to improve the relationship between the Emperor and the Empress, for understanding another's story is the foundation of building meaningful connections. Despite this, Adele showed no sympathy for the Emperor, lacking a deep understanding of the Empress herself. Adele let out a long sigh, brushing her hair back to reveal her shining golden eyes amidst her dark locks. "When I first met the Emperor, he was hostile towards me, and I wondered why. You said it was because he saw me and the previous Empress on the same level. What does that mean?" Adele asked. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Giggs replied, "I mean that I was worried as soon as I arrived here. When did I ever meet Emperor Emont before? I even saw his portrait for the first time on my way here. How baffled I must have been by his hostility. But I never thought it would stem from a deep-seated attachment and resentment towards the position of Empress itself. What is there to compare between me and the previous Empress? Adele continued. It's an unconscious reaction, not a rational decision, Mrs. Giggs explained. It's problematic when the highest ruler has instincts that overpower reason, Adele exclaimed, her anger flaring up. But, as you said, he is the supreme, Mrs. Giggs added hesitantly. And, Adele prompted, Your Majesty, he is the Most High and Your Majesty's consort, Mrs. Giggs responded. And, Adele repeated, growing impatient. So, it is imperative that you humble yourself and accept the authority of the Empress to please the Emperor. Did you not think that Lionel Balder's arrival would displease the Emperor? Mrs. Giggs asked, not shying away from the truth. Adele was furious, her chest boiling like lava, as Mrs. Giggs looked on with a perplexed expression. On the first day I arrived, Diane Poitiers came to see me and offered to enlighten me on His Majesty's preferences, Adele stated. Mrs. Giggs' eyes flared with anger. How dare she? She dared to come to me and say it. She instructed me to conform my appearance to His Majesty's preferences. Mrs. Giggs bowed her head and apologized. I'm sorry. You need not apologize, Mrs. But what distinguishes what you said to me just now from what Diane Poitiers said that day? Your Majesty the Empress. Do you know what I told her? I claimed that she had never considered attempting to mold me to someone else's preferences. She spoke firmly, reminding herself and her elderly lady of her true purpose. The Empress understood that her beliefs and values were her guiding principles, the very foundation of her identity. She refused to compromise them for anyone or anything, even if that meant clashing with the Emperor himself. The most important thing in the world is none other than me, Adelaide itself, she whispered, reaffirming her sense of self. That's ahead of the position of Emperor. So, he is dead when he dies, but he can never obey the command to hold his breath and wield whatever he wants. Do you understand? Mrs. Giggs nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. Empress Adelaide continued with a sense of finality. If you find it difficult to have me as the Empress, feel free to tell me. I'm really sorry. I cross my line, Mrs. Giggs murmured, but Adelaide was already turning away. In less than an hour after storming out of the Empress Palace with an angry expression, the Emperor returned, his face contorted with a dangerous intensity, resembling a dark fire. Mrs. Giggs, who had rushed out with a surprised look, was caught off guard when the Emperor stopped in front of her. Is the Empress available for a joint audience today? The Emperor asked, his question directly and to the point. Mrs. Giggs was taken aback and unable to respond. The Emperor scrutinized her face for a moment before muttering, Seeing as you cannot answer, it appears that it is indeed possible. With that, the Emperor left the bewildered Mrs. Giggs behind and strode into the Empress' bedroom with a sense of purpose. Adele was just about to fall asleep when Carl barged into her bedroom without so much as a knock, his tyrannical spirit on full display. His abrupt intrusion left her speechless. What are you doing? She managed to blurt out. I want to spend the night with you, he declared, his eyes full of an intense, dangerous energy that reminded Adele of a glass of overflowing wine. He thought, an emperor is someone who always gets what he wants. He has no reason to hesitate or suppress his desire, even if the other party is the Empress. But Adele's eyes were filled with a different kind of energy, one that could kill. Despite his desire, Carl could sense her reluctance. You said you'd regret it less than an hour ago, yet now you want to suddenly have a first night together. Don't you think we should first acknowledge each other as spouses? She questioned him. Carl kneeled on the edge of her bed, the sweet scent of spring flowers surrounding them. You seem to be struggling to gain proper power in the imperial palace. What more do you need to go back to? As the Empress, it is your duty to do your job and gain your strength. I will hold it in my hand, he told her, trying to convince her to give in to him. As Karl's hand gently pressed against Adele's shoulder, the Empress remained unmoved, her expression devoid of any passion or enthusiasm. Karl stepped back, taking in the chill emanating from her demeanor. It's complicated, he said, and Adele was taken aback. Was she considering seizing power as Empress without fulfilling her duties? The thought sent shivers down Adele's spine. Despite being her spouse, their first night together was a natural obligation. It was only fitting, but Adele couldn't shake off the feeling of dirtiness that came with it. As she looked at the distorted expression on the Empress's face, Karl whispered, "What I said, is it so degrading? Is there anyone else in this empire whom you would bow to besides me?" Adele snarled in response, "Is it the Empress's unconditional obligation to bow to the Emperor? Is that how it is in Emont?" Karl gazed at her with intense focus, revealing a small, white foot. The foot was delicate, reminiscent of a wild beast's, and Karl lowered his head slowly, holding her ankle with one hand. As he stared into Adele's golden gaze, his purple eyes ablaze, he kissed the tender spot where he had entered. Something soft and squishy fell from Adele's ankle with a wet sound. The Emperor lifted Adele up and whispered, gazing at her with intense focus. "Now that I have bowed my head and kissed your feet, are you satisfied?" Adele had been born into a flawless royal family with a perfect lineage, and her proud, arrogant face was befitting of her upbringing. She had lived a life free from the constraints of submission. As Karl leaned forward, his movements reminiscent of a carnivore biting into its prey, he cupped Adele's cheek with one hand. As he trailed his hand down the nape of her neck, a sense of immense pleasure surged through him. He let out a low sigh as he traced her red lips with his thumb, intending to press her chin down and force his way into her gaping mouth. But a cold voice cut through the moment. "Let go," Adele said. Despite her warning, Karl did not release his grip on her neck. As the two locked eyes, a golden glint flickered in Adele's gaze, and her lips curled into a cold smile. She cut off Karl's hand, and his eyes filled with displeasure. "You do not know your place," he said icily. He continued, "You chose to protect your ego by baring your teeth, even when your grand pride is the only thing you possess. I really can't understand you. Kneel down to me, bow your head, submit." Adele recoiled, spitting out her response with defiance. "I will not, I won't." He continued, "You will regret it someday." Karl studied Adele's face, then took a step back. She had no idea how contorted her expression had become. Seeing the disheveled state of the Empress, he felt satisfied, even though the heat had dissipated. She remembered how everyone is. Just like her mother. They all wanted to hurt her pride and want her to be obedient girl just as they wanted. She didn't even know when she fell asleep. She felt a touch on the tip of her abyss with her fingertips. Could it be that the devil crawled out of the darkness and embraced her from behind? "It's Hannah Giggs, Your Majesty." "Did you cough?" Her agitated heart cooled. "Come in." Mrs. Giggs appeared with the same face and appearance as yesterday. "What's going on?" she asked with a cold tone. Mrs. Giggs was silent for a moment at the question's cold tone. It was a moment that felt like time had stretched out. "His Majesty's Majesty has ordered that the Empress Palace's supplementary budget be cancelled." Even that was news from the Ivory Palace. Just like that, when the news of the loss of the supplementary budget of the Empress Palace hit the palace like a fire spreading in a dry field, the Empress Palace also set up a counterfire without losing. Appoints Lionel Balder as assistant to the Empress. In the last video, because Empress Adele reject Emperor he cancelled her supplement budget, and Lionel Balgier was appointed as the Empress aide. The Empress is fighting fire with fire. It was a coveted honor, to be chosen as the Empress aide. Lionel would go down in history as the only member of the Balder family to achieve this feat. When news of Lionel Balder's appointment as the Empress aide spread throughout the imperial palace along with the cancellation of the supplementary budget for the Empress Palace, the entire establishment was rocked to its core. These two stories consumed people, causing them to lose track of time and their senses. The members of the noble family were incredulous when they heard that the proud young boy had become the Empress aide. The butler, who had witnessed Theseus and Lionel's growth since childhood, maintained that this decision was solely Lionel's personal choice. He asked, "Why did you make this decision, my lord?" Lionel replied, "I've been on the defensive like this. Shouldn't I try everything I can?" Lionel asked, determined. "Also, it wasn't the Duke's will, it was the boy's will," the butler muttered. "Is my older brother the one to give me such an order?" Lionel questioned. The butler smiled vacantly and stepped back, but the tip of his nose grew cold for no apparent reason. Why did our young master do that? Why in the world would he take such a risk? But the butler couldn't say anything to Lionel. Then Lionel bid farewell and went for Empress Palace. In the grand halls of the Empress Palace, Empress Adelaide reclined leisurely on a couch, relishing the cool autumn breeze that wafted in through the open windows. The sight of her indolently propped-up body, with only her feet bobbing, was a novelty for Mrs. Giggs, who had served the late Empress. Empress Adelaide was a strange figure, one that Mrs. Giggs found difficult to describe, for she was tyrannical in her mannerisms and debauched in her ways. Although Mrs. Giggs dared not speak of it, Empress Adelaide seemed perfectly suited to this lifestyle. Most of the maids who served her hailed from Diane, and yet, they offered no discernible information to Mrs. Giggs. Their fear of the Empress seemed to be instinctual, more a result of her predatory nature than any explicit act of tyranny. Even as the Empress lounged lazily like a tiger, hiding her claws and teeth, one could never tell when she might suddenly strike and bite down with ferocity. While the Empress rarely spoke to her ladies-in-waiting, she would often stop and stare at them as they went about their business, her piercing yellow gaze almost too intense to bear. Observing the Empress's face, Mrs. Giggs could not help but wonder if a wild beast had truly transformed into a human. Suddenly, the Empress spoke up, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. "She's watching us," she remarked, causing Adele to startle. "I think you'll find out what to say to the princess, Mrs. Giggs responded, her voice betraying her fear. Adele looked sideways at the ladies-in-waiting who kept a watchful eye on her and then closed her eyes, realizing how difficult it was to maintain her composure under such scrutiny. "Have there been fewer visitors to the Ivory Palace lately?" Empress Adelaide queried, catching Mrs. Giggs off guard. "No one has visited the Ivory Palace in the past week," Mrs. Giggs replied, sensing that the Empress was searching for something. "Well, that's hardly surprising. There's nothing to confess, at least not until last night," the Empress said, her tone conveying her displeasure. "Your Majesty the Empress," Mrs. Giggs interjected. "It's not the right time to argue with His Majesty the Emperor. Do you think I should not have refused his advances on the first night?" Empress Adelaide retorted, her voice laced with bitterness. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. But you know that it was inevitable. Furthermore, the consequences may rebound onto you," Mrs. Giggs responded, trying to placate the Empress. "Then Empress Adele Lady-in-Waiting, inform her that the Lord Lionel Valgier has arrived." Lionel had arrived after being summoned by the Empress. He greets her. "Good morning, Her Majesty." "Welcome, I've been awaiting your arrival, Lionel," she said, her smile captivating the maids, who could only gawk in response. Even Lionel, who knew full well of her amicable demeanor, found himself catching his breath in response to the warm, friendly tone that now pierced his ears. Bowing respectfully, he managed to compose himself. "Your Majesty the Empress," he said in a calm voice, before inquiring about refreshments. The maids, with great caution, asked whether they should provide them, to which Adele, glancing toward Lionel, replied nonchalantly, "I'll have tea." The ladies in waiting bowed politely, then exited the room, their glances surreptitiously flitting between the two. Before long, wordless rumors would likely be spreading like wildfire. Once alone, with only the two of them in the room, the Empress crossed her arms and spoke. "Soon, a rumor will spread throughout the Empress Palace. Everyone will say that the Empress and her aide are so affectionate. I really okay you. Of course, I mean as an aide. Let's get along well from now on, Lionel." He replied, "Yes, Your Majesty." She continued, "It isn't easy for me either there. Dropping all formalities and pretending to be close. Since I'm putting in this much effort, you should reciprocate with longer answers. It'd be bad if there's a rumor about the Empress trying to woo Lionel Valgier one-sidedly." Lionel paused for a moment then spoke. "I am looking forward to your kind cooperation, Your Majesty. I will my best, so you won't regret choosing me." Empress Adele giggles and spoke while giggling. "Nice, I will make sure to remember your words," she muttered. "It's fun to tease him." Lionel blushes and thought, why do I feel that she was just teasing me? She present him some sweet and asked to try them. She spoke. "I heard these are the most delicious in Egmont." He looked at her and spoke. "You don't have to go out of your way to do this." She replied, "What's so hard about offering some refreshments?" She replied, "I've always been like this. It's just that I haven't found time to do it here." Lionel had half expected her to be incensed and indignant, yet she remained calm and composed. Nonetheless, she must have been seething inwardly, he thought. Tensing up once more, Lionel refused to let his guard down in the face of her seemingly insolent demeanor. Meanwhile, Adele, having lifted her own teacup, gazed intently at Lionel through the rising steam, her exquisitely beautiful face. After gracefully swallowing, she sipped her tea, lips pursed, before continuing in a gentle tone, "In any case, do you want me to attract some of the concentrated power wielded by the court magicians?" "Ultimately, yes. Furthermore, I hope for a change in the current oppositional approach to the tower. In Egmont, the Mage Guild monopolizes and withholds all information regarding the tower. Then the tower becomes power." That was what her mother had desired. The tower is an opportunity. A golden opportunity to wield divine authority instead of imperial authority. If I can use this power wisely, can I not become an emperor? No, the entire royal family can become gods. They monopolize and withhold information and even dictate the necessary structures according to their own whims. It is not surprising that the magicians possess the power of life and death. "What does Your Majesty the Empress seek from me?" Lionel inquired, his voice laced with anticipation. Adele bestowed a gentle smile on Lionel, her eyes shimmering with a hint of mischief. "Didn't you already divulge the answer to that query on the very day you graced us with your presence for the interview?" Her voice danced with a playful cadence, adding a touch of intrigue to their conversation. Adele's countenance beamed with contentment, knowing she had made the right decision. "Fortunately, our immediate objectives align harmoniously," she began, her voice growing more animated. "In due course, I shall employ my prowess as a mage to establish a formidable position within Egmont's political realm. I implore you to cooperate until the time arrives." "Are you intending to address the cancellation of the supplementary budget for the Empress Palace?" he inquired, his voice tinged with a touch of intrigue. "Even if it wasn't your intention, I would have broached the subject nonetheless. Rest assured, I shall lodge a formal objection directly with His Majesty the Emperor, on behalf of House Balder and Your Majesty, the Empress." Adele's expression brimmed with satisfaction, her approval evident in the subtle nod of her head. Revenge, an ever-enticing notion, lingered in the depths of her thoughts. She spoke. "Great, that's the best news I've ever heard recently. However, can a momentary protest like that be called proper revenge, since he has insulted me in such a childish way. She gave Lionel something to read. He read the context of letter. Then he spoke. You want to give him a fuss of his own medicine. Precisely, she hadn't intended to go this far. As if getting slapped in the imperial palace and venting her anger at the ivory palace. But now that they were joining forces and overturning the tables, there was no longer any reason to distinguish between the two. While the Empress and her advisor were conversing, a group of merchants with travel permits appeared at the Empress's palace. Startled, the maidservants waved their hands at the person leading the group. Hold on a moment. I didn't summon their leader. One of the ladies in waiting exclaimed, taken aback. Currently, Her Majesty the Empress is not in the mood to entertain merchants. However, their leader spoke assertively, her eyes gleaming with a sense of opportunity that couldn't be missed. I understand. Her Majesty the Empress can choose only the items that interest her. Consider it a form of gift-giving, the leader explained confidently. Gift. The court lady couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding, her back drenched in cold sweat. It seemed unwise to inquire further. Nonetheless, the lead merchant continued his speech with great enthusiasm. Indeed, it is a gift, he affirmed. The Empress, her curiosity piqued, inquired, and who sent you? It was Diane Poitier who sent us. Gigs. Following the cancellation of the supplementary budget for the Empress Palace, a gift had been sent to the Empress from the Ivory Palace. It even came with accompanying cards. Adele accepted the card offered by Mrs. Giggs and read it without missing a beat. What does it say? Mrs. Giggs cautiously inquired, while Lionel also observed the Empress attentively. They are giving me a loan. I am to use the funds to purchase whatever I desire, up to the value of the previously allocated budget supplement. A gesture, perhaps, in preparation for the upcoming national holiday. Since they are known for their skilled craftsmanship, I should be able to find something that satisfies me. It's enough to bring tears to my eyes, Adele muttered, her voice tinged with a mixture of gratitude and irritation. I intend to challenge this matter officially, Adele said. Are you proposing an immediate eviction order? Lionel answered. Is there any other viable alternative? When Adele, having risen from her seat, posed the question while settling back down, Lionel responded with earnestness etched upon his face. If he is expelled unconditionally, it may evoke sympathy for Diane Poitier instead. Instead, Adele leaned closer, her eyes shimmering with intrigue. Come now, do tell, prompted by Adele. Lionel whispered his thoughts in a hushed tone, and as he concluded, Adele's eyes widened with immense satisfaction, and she gently tapped her chin with her finger, with an authentic countenance, as if traversing solely in search of the righteous path. It was truly remarkable, was it not? What do you say? He asked. Meanwhile, Diane, surrounded by an array of opulence, received word that the merchants had returned without even venturing past the threshold of the Empress Palace. Gazing upon a platinum necklace, she mumbled as she adorned it around her neck, while the shop owner discreetly stole glances at her reflection in the mirror. She muttered, Your Majesty, you are truly too much, cancelling the Empress Palace budget. How upset Her Majesty the Empress must be. So, I sent the merchants to buy a necklace with the amount of money that was supposed to be spent on the budget. What will you do on the National Day in a few months? While Diane was examining a platinum necklace, muttering to herself, the court lady who had been holding a mirror in front of her silently looked at her face. I am truly puzzled. He gave me the budget proposal for the Empress's palace and told me to buy what I want. Your Highness, your kind heart is as beautiful as your face. It is natural for His Majesty the Emperor to devote his heartfelt affection to your Highness, isn't it? Those people praised Diane, seeming deeply moved, and the attendants standing by also expressed their agreement without anything to do. These compliments never failed to please Diana. She spoke. Please refrain from making such comments. I have expressly expressed my embarrassment and concern. She muttered in herself. With this, I hope you finally realize who is the real owner of the royal palace, Your Majesty. Meanwhile in Empress's palace, after proposing such a scheme, Empress Adele trying to understand what's in Lionel's minds, she folded her hands, and thought, I'm speechless, with how upright he is, I can't believe he actually came up with this scheme. She smiled gently. Then spoke, so it was true you took the aide position of your own free will. Lionel smiled and said, didn't I tell you so, Your Majesty, and at today's meeting, I will formally raise a protest regarding the issue of the supplementary budget revision. The path's conclusion and the outcome remained elusive, yet who could truly foresee them? Adele tapped the weighty archery book with her right hand and directed her words to the faceless Empress of yesteryear, who had once engaged in a fierce battle with her spouse. She replied, great, I look to it. Let the dog fight begin. The bustling merchants bid farewell to the Ivory Palace. Diane roamed through the gathering of merchants, who revered her like the sovereign of a nation, in a state of intoxication. For her, amassing precious jewels was not merely a display of affluence, it represented her lofty position, while the act of spending money itself symbolized her authority. Originally, the funds bestowed upon her by the emperor were a single gold bar and a single silver bar, constituting the supplementary budget for the Empress Palace. However, the exorbitant sum quoted by the merchants exceeded twice that amount. But what use was there in fretting over such trivial matters? She possessed the Ivory Palace's budget, after all. It encompassed not only the funds allocated for the bond but also served as a convenient pretext. With no need for meticulous record-keeping or meticulous expenditure justification, Diane unabashedly withdrew the money and indulged in her spending spree without a trace of hesitation. Diane was left alone in the room, feeling strangely unsettled. It hadn't been like this just a moment ago. The hustle and bustle of the merchant's flattery and praise, the maid's flattery and commotion during the selection and finalization of purchases, it had been fine then. But now, with the people who treated her like a queen gone, her time as a queen had come to an end. Diane forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the turbulent emotions within her chest. Yet, despite her efforts, she couldn't seem to find peace. She stood up and began pacing restlessly. The emperor had come last night, unexpectedly, and disappeared just as abruptly. And then he returned. It was peculiar behavior. When he returned, he did nothing for Diane but sleep, without even lifting a finger. He seemed to have no intention of explaining where he had been or why he had done such a thing. So she couldn't even ask. Why did he suddenly behave that way? Why did he suddenly ask the questions she had never asked before, sniffing at her neck? In an instant, her heart, which had only been roiling, seemed to sink with a thud. As a terrifying thought brushed her mind, she couldn't help but run outside and call for Lorraine. Lorraine, Lorraine. Yes, Your Highness, you called, Lorraine replied. Go to the maids of the Empress's palace right away and bring only one person who won't be noticed. Hurry, Diane ordered. Yes, yes, Lorraine then went off. As Diane anxiously paced the room, she rushed towards Lorraine as soon as she returned and grabbed the shoulder of one of the maids in the Empress's palace, almost like a drowning person clutching a lifeline. Your Highness, Empress maid spoke. Did His Majesty visit the Empress's palace yesterday? Diane inquired. Yes, yes, maid replied. Diane asked, did His Majesty go to the Empress's palace yesterday? Trembling in fear from Diane's intimidating demeanor, the maid replied as best she knew. How many times? Twice, Your Highness. Feeling a chill run down her spine, Diane let out a groan. Fear rushed over her like a tidal wave. Amidst the intense clash between her desire to know and her desire to remain ignorant, Diane managed to gather herself, but barely. When did he come? Tell me about each time. It was a growling sound, reminiscent of a fierce beast. It was evening. Before Her Majesty went to sleep, she took a bath, and right after that, he came. And then, as if he were angry, he left, only to return less than an hour later. He didn't even stay for 20 minutes. Diane asked, what was the time of her second visit? Around 10 o'clock, maid replied. The maid nodded as if she were sure and answered. Diane, who had been gripping her shoulder tightly, slowly released her hand as if her strength had left her, and the maid stepped back, bowing slightly. Diane, who stood there absent-mindedly, feeling drained, Diane's pupils trembled uncontrollably. He went to the Empress's palace and then came here, and he returned to the Empress with that face, purple eyes filled with excitement and ragged breath. I know that face of yours. Only I know. It should be known only to me. Why did you run to the Empress's palace with that face? She suddenly rushed to the mirror, and she looked at her own face. Wrinkles have appeared. There's no radiance. Your Majesty likes my skin. She should have called a skincare specialist instead of a merchant. The touch that had been checking her waist to see if her figure was still fine had suddenly reached her lower abdomen. There was not a trace of flab on her flat belly. She wasn't pleased to see it as slim as her belly. Why won't it happen? Why on earth? According to the palace physician, both she and the emperor were not infertile. They were both healthy. Several people confirmed that fact. But why? Diane murmured desperately, with a tone of despair, pleading earnestly. Crying without even realizing it, pouring out her whole heart. Please let a child be conceived. Save me. Meanwhile, at the Empress's palace, Mrs. Giggs informed Empress, one of the Ivory Palace maids took a handmaiden with her. Empress replied, she must be curious about something. What should we do? Mrs. Giggs asked. Adele, who had been moving her pen without pause, stopped her hand and looked up at the question. Mrs. Giggs, who had been assisting her in writing orders, calmly faced her with a cold expression. Mrs. Giggs said, should we recruit new maids? Empress asked, do you know anyone suitable? Mrs. Giggs replied, I will search for trustworthy individuals. If she asked, Lady Giggs would swiftly arrange everything. However, Adele couldn't easily give her permission. Her mouth felt rough, as if she had swallowed gravel. Could she completely trust anyone she called? It would be better to rely on those who knew whose puppets they were. Empress said, no, it's fine. If we expose this, there will be quite a commotion for a while. So, let's put that issue aside for now. After all, you are the one who takes care of my affairs, so whatever the maids report to Diane won't be of great importance. Mrs. Giggs replied, yes, I understand. Empress Adele spoke. Let's continue with what we were doing. To think that my first decree as Empress would be like this. The afternoon in the Central Council chamber. Currently, the residents of Count Calvin have taken refuge in the nearby Baroltol County, where Count Barolteth and Viscount Orlean are holding off the monsters in the intermediate zone. The tower in Count Calvin has estimated a Class 3 flying-type monster, Gargoyle, appearing. Theseus stared at Duke Lennox Poitiers and Duke Despon with cold eyes. Lennox, with his consistently indifferent expression, listened to the man's report. Lennox Poitiers, estimated level 3. Who exactly made that estimate? Didn't we see Gagnier, not Gargoyle? Gargoyle is not captured so easily. A bunch of knights without any wizards. Hearing this, the commander of the guard, Henri Jackal, stood up abruptly, expressing his anger. Mere knights, how dare you? Then can you explain to me why the mighty magicians are roaming around here instead of going out and fighting off the monsters themselves? Flames surged from Lennox's eyes in response to Henri Jackal's rage. What did you just said? Duke Despon grabbed Lennox, who was about to rise from his seat, holding him back, and spoke. Stop it, Lennox, His Majesty is watching. Against Duke Despon's objection, Lennox snorted harshly and sat back down. I apologize, Your Majesty. Lennox replied. It was unclear whether the emperor acknowledged or ignored his apology. Since the start of the meeting, he had been continuously staring at Lionel with a stern and threatening gaze. It was a gaze that seemed ready to pounce. He had always been someone who displeased him, but today it felt even more irritating. He spoke. What are your thoughts, Minister of Defense? Answer, please. The chilling question made Lionel turn his head to face the emperor. Carl leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and leaning his body forward. Countless eyes in the central council chamber were fixed on Lionel all at once. However, he showed no signs of wavering. Lionel replied, I don't have an answer for you. However, could I possibly raise some questions to the two people who are responsible for the Department of Magicians? Carl gestured toward Duke Despon and Duke Lennox, giving his permission, and Lionel opened his mouth as if signaling them to wait. Emperor said, as you wish. Lionel continued, then I'll start with my questions. The day a tower descended from the sky, I led my knights there and waited for the magician's arrival. While the tower kept descending by the second, the one who showed up there was someone I never expected. It was Her Majesty. Carl's eyebrows twitched, and he found himself unconsciously biting his lower lip as he glared at Lionel. A sense of inexplicable discomfort that had been trapped behind a transparent barrier suddenly burst forth. Ignoring the Emperor's intense gaze directed at him, and thought, how dare he bring the Empress in front of me? Lionel continued to speak. Was Her Majesty, the Empress. She suddenly appeared and said that someone around level 4 could handle it alone. In reality, what she said was that someone around level 5 or close to it could handle it alone, but Lionel intentionally left out the first part. The people from the Balder estate and the knightly houses kept nodding their heads as they listened to him. And as you all know, she destroyed the tower alone. She did it in a way that no one had ever seen before. She rode up on an updraft before the tower hit the ground. Thanks to her, not even a single mount was able to leave the tower, and there were no casualties. Lionel looked at Duke Despon and Lennox in turn, and with each word he spoke, he drove the point home. You never even thought of that method in Emont, did you? Remembering the feeling of helplessness he felt when he led the wizards to the tower, only to watch helplessly as the Empress single-handedly destroyed it and left the garden calmly, Lennox's bitterness erupted from his throat. Indeed, Lionel Balder, it seems that you have the Empress's favor on your side. You know her very well, don't you? Even in the face of the Emperor's hostile question, Lionel remained composed and calmly replied, Her Majesty, the Empress, said that if flying-type mounts appear, measures equivalent to level 3 should be taken. She advised Count Calvin to seek refuge in another territory and provided financial support for that reason. The conference room buzzed with murmurs upon hearing his words. The Empress said that to Count Calvin. As far as I know, she gave him a gold bar. Quote. Duke Despon, who had been observing the situation, leaned back with force against his chin. Lionel continued to observe the turmoil for a while before locking eyes with Duke Despon, who had been watching him. Lionel continued, I am returning the question that His Majesty asked me to you. Why are the Emont magicians merely observing the current situation? Is it because they have no intention of rescuing, or because they lack the capability? As the Minister of Defense, I will answer His Majesty's inquiry. Rescue them. If it is not a matter of capability, then dispatch the wizards immediately and save them without fail. Theseus, who had been guarding Lionel's side, also stood up and spoke. I find myself desiring to hear directly from Her Majesty's opinions in person. For the same reason, it is believed that the rightful Empress should be given the authority she deserves. What exactly is the basis for rejecting the budget proposal? Hearing Empress' name again, Emperor can't hold back anymore, he spoke. You seem to be mentioning the Empress a lot now that you have become her aide. This is why there's a saying that one should take great care when choosing their partner. Even among commoners, it's always the wife who supports the husband. you should assess the situation properly instead of just flaunting your relationship. Don't you think so, Minister of Defense? It was a blatant criticism, an attempt to belittle the absent Empress and evade Lionel's reasonable question. Theseus stood up and spoke. Your Majesty, your words are too harsh. It was a precarious moment, as if the fragile silence was about to shatter. Just as one could sense a sense of urgency, a courtier hurriedly entered the conference room and approached the Emperor Karl, who had been leaning against his chair, sat up straight and looked at the courtier. The courtier pulled out a thick document from his bosom. He told Emperor, Her Majesty has withdrawn the Ivory Palace's residency permit for Lady Diana Poitiers. What? He spoke. Then his brows furrowed. It was an official order with the Empress's seal clearly stamped on it. Lennox, caught off guard, blinked in bewilderment before rising from his seat with righteous indignation. This cannot be. His Majesty the Emperor granted permission. Lennox protested vehemently, his voice brimming with outrage. The attendant regarded Lennox with a hint of surprise before turning his gaze back to the Emperor, his lips parting to deliver further information. According to the palace's laws, Her Majesty the Empress possesses the authority to decide on residency permissions within the Imperial Palace. However, in acknowledgement of Lady Diane Poitiers's merits in attending to the Emperor and overseeing various affairs of the Imperial Palace, His Majesty expressed his intent to grant her a special residency within the Ivory Palace. For a moment, the officials contemplated this revelation, their heads tilting in confusion. Had anything truly changed? Before they could voice their thoughts, the attendant continued, unraveling the intricacies of the situation. Nevertheless, it is not permissible, under the strict protocols of the court, to privately manage the residence of individuals who are neither members of the imperial family nor hold a defined position. Thus, if Lady Diane Poitiers wishes to reside there, she is to be recognized as a guest, occupying a designated room within the Ivory Palace and bearing the expenses associated with it, which shall be charged to the house of Count Poitiers. In essence, the message was clear. If she desired to stay, she would have to foot the bill for her stay. The Empress had meticulously calculated the costs, considering the wages of the staff, maintenance expenses for the room, and even the usage fees for the amenities. The figures reached astronomical heights, befitting the price to inhabit the famed Ivory Palace, renowned as the Empire's epitome of beauty. The weight of Adelaide's decision descended upon Karl Ulrich and Diane Poitiers like a crushing blow. Enraged, the Emperor sprang to his feet and forcefully exited the meeting room, his actions a display of frustration and anger. Lennox, who clung desperately to the hapless attendant, unleashed his fury before trailing after his sovereign. Meanwhile, the majority of the senior officials busied themselves with discreet whispers, their faces alight with amusement. To them, observing the turmoil within someone else's household proved to be the most entertaining spectacle. From their perspective, the Empress's edict appeared, in principle, eminently reasonable. Indeed, this is the truth, one official murmured, acknowledging the validity of the decision. It is indeed the case, Lionel began, his voice barely above a whisper, as the commotion unfolded around them. Her Majesty the Empress possesses considerable resources. She is willing to grant a residence permit, but she expects compensation in return. Theseus leaned closer to Lionel, his tone hushed, and asking rent in exchange for staying at the Ivory Palace. Lionel, it definitely was your idea, wasn't it? Lionel smiled and spoke. Seems like my big brother knows me well. Theseus sighed, and muttered, this cunning guy, he intentionally caused a problem just big enough to be within their powers to resolve. I can't really scold him for it. Lionel leaned in close to Theseus and spoke softly, there's something I need to tell you, brother. Theseus responded, his voice tinged with concern, did something happen? Meanwhile, at that very moment, the grand doors of the Empress's palace swung open with a resounding bang. Who dared to fling wide the imposing gates of the Emont Empire's Empress Palace with such audacity? Startled, the ladies-in-waiting hurriedly emerged, their heads bowed in fear. The emperor strode past them, his presence akin to a gust of wind. At that precise instant, a figure materialized on the second-floor staircase. Karl, poised to ascend, halted abruptly. The two locked eyes, positioned as adversaries on opposite ends of the staircase. Clad in a black robe, the Empress revealed a pair of sturdy boots beneath her garb, eschewing the customary courtly footwear. The ladies-in-waiting swiftly sidestepped, seeking refuge from the brewing tension. The atmosphere crackled with an imminent clash, as if a confrontation were on the brink of eruption. "Where do you think you're going, dressed as such, Empress?" Karl was the first to break the silence, his voice as cutting as ever. Adele descended the stairs deliberately, inching closer to him. Their gazes clashed like blades, their necks taut with anticipation. Adele paused a few steps higher than Karl, positioning them at eye level. "What business have you?" The impulse to crush those alluring lips, which uttered their demands with such force, surged within Karl. "Step back." Karl's sudden words reverberated, prompting Adele to respond without hesitation, her gaze unwavering. "You step back first, and why should I retreat? I'm not casting her out entirely. You may continue residing her if you so desire, but she should pay a fair price. Is there a more just proposition than this?" Emperor said, "I have nothing further to say. Step back, this instant." Empress continued, "Your Majesty should rectify matters first. The cost of one thoroughbred horse. Today, merchants dispatched from the Ivory Palace arrived, spent precisely the same amount that was cut from the supplemental budget on jewelry or garments. We have sent them all back." A sneer tugged at Karl's lips. "Merely a tease, I suppose." At those words, Karl's brow furrowed. Empress continued, "For those who draw swords, one must engage in swordplay. Have you not heard this Emont proverb?" Polite in her demeanor, Adele courteously greeted him before attempting to sidestep past him. Or so she intended. Karl seized her shoulders, spinning her around as he growled, his tone menacing. "Shouts, didn't I inquire about your destination?" Meeting his intense gaze head-on, Adele responded with calm composure. "I shall go incognito," Adele declared. Secretly, Karl inquired. She continued, "According to Article 14, Paragraph 2 of the Palace Law, the Empress has the right to venture out incognito without the Emperor's permission, and she may keep her whereabouts and purpose undisclosed." Emperor replied, "Seems you have memorized all the damn regulations." With calm demeanor she continued, "What else could I have done? At least we won't need a budget for an extravagant horse. Let us depart now." Adele shrugged off the Emperor's hand that grasped her shoulder and straightened her attire. She continued, "I wish to witness the lives of the common people of Emont. Seeing it firsthand will grant me a better understanding than merely hearing about it." She took a step back and spoke resolutely, "It will likely take 3 or 4 days." It was an announcement. The Empress possessed that right, and Karl had no means to compel Adele to turn back and walk away. Her dark tresses swayed gracefully, and with each movement, it seemed that Karl himself was shaken. He yearned to have a leash around that woman's neck, to grasp it firmly. He longed to intimidate her, demanding where she dared to go without permission. If only he could employ force and threats to make her regret her actions. What would I do if she simply continued on her way? But he remained silent, for he had not granted her any permission as her emperor. With nothing but his own name, the Empress had nothing to lose. Balder, the coachman of the Balder estate, was a man of great pride as a member of the Balder family. He knew the Empress would route a carriage, so naturally, he was very nervous. Upon the Empress's arrival, he greeted her and opened the door, and she stepped inside the carriage and waited for Balder brothers. The coachman rushed toward the two with eager strides. Surprised by the coachman's unusual expression, Theseus nodded his head and took a confident step forward and spoke. Is our honored guest in the carriage? Yes, indeed, coachman replied. Theseus nodded and strode ahead, and spoke. Behave as if nothing happened. As his taller brother brushed past him, giving him a warning, the coachman quickly smoothed his face with his hands and held his breath. In no time, he returned to his usual demeanor and promptly returned to his position. As the two entered the carriage, the person inside, wrapped in a robe from head to toe, slowly turned their head. In the evening light, a secret exchange took place, wrapped in mystery. Adele, wearing a hood to hide her face, looked briefly at Lionel's brother, who sat across from her. She smiled slightly and apologized for taking an unattended carriage earlier. Sorry for taking the carriage without permission, she said. She then removed her hood and greeted him politely. Hello, Lord Balder. Although the Empress seemed calm and relaxed, Adele could sense that she was troubled. Adele hid her own worries well, not showing any signs of unrest. She knew she needed the approval of Theseus, her brother, for her kind act toward Lionel. Adele had packed her things carefully, expecting Lionel to call her and confirm Duke Balder's consent. However, during the intense encounter with the Emperor at the Empress place, she impulsively left without gathering her essentials. I was waiting for the public's approval, to be honest. It's a bit late to admit it now that we're already in this carriage, but I thought it was necessary, Adele said with a kind smile, looking at his brother. Would it be okay if I took care of your needs for 3 or 4 days? She asked. Theseus replied without hesitation. Yes, Her Majesty, it would be my pleasure. The calmness that now surrounded the siblings brought relief to the Empress. Lionel, sitting close to her, found it hard to ignore the Empress's presence in the small carriage, despite her efforts. Theseus, too, seemed unconsciously fascinated by the Empress's graceful appearance. He wondered where she got her perfectly fitting black dress and elegant boots. The Empress leaned against the carriage wall, lost in her own thoughts, her golden eyes constantly scanning. After a moment of contemplation, she asked Adele an unexpected question. Is this the common standard of living in the capital? The roads, well maintained and resplendent, hosted a plethora of immaculate establishments, bustling with activity. Merchants engaged in transactions, children frolicked amidst the crowd, and passers-by, adorned in meticulously tailored attire, added to the visual symphony. Though the edifices lacked the grandiosity of Leviathan's spine, they were impeccably maintained, free of any signs of dilapidation, and adorned with delicate floral arrangements. Not a trace of filth marred the thoroughfares, and destitution seemed an unfamiliar concept. Adele regarded this panorama with rapt attention, her eyes drinking in the scene before her. What do you see? Theseus's question drew Adele's attention away from the window. She spoke. The clothing appears tidy and well kept, and although I can't discern the interiors of the houses, the exteriors are adorned with neatness. It seems that one can lead a decent life here, so I would consider it a middle-class neighborhood, even though it may not be entirely normal for commoners. How about you? In Gotrov, this would be considered one of the affluent areas. What about Emont? Have you spent a lot of time undercover? Theseus asked. She replied, I've spent more time outside the palace than within its walls. Now, please answer my question. He continued, yes, you're correct. This is a middle-class residential district. Just around 10 minutes north, there's a sprawling slum that stretches across a small river. Adele locked eyes with Theseus. He continued, in the end, those who lost their hometowns due to the tower have nowhere else to go but these slums. They're springing up and expanding across most territories, including the capital. May I ask why you summoned Count Calvin? The carriage sped onward, entering the shade of the arboretum. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the towering trees, enveloping the interior of the carriage in darkness. She spoke. It was the least humans could do for their own kind. He might not have been of much assistance, but I wanted to extend some aid. This response ignited the Emperor's fury. Did you engage in any rescue operations while you were in Gotrov? Lionel asked. He was certain she had. The Empress had undoubtedly been more resolute in demolishing the tower than anyone else. The manner in which she obliterated the tower was an achievement even skilled individuals couldn't replicate. As if confirming Lionel's assumptions, the Empress slowly nodded. However, what she uttered next caught the Balder brothers off guard. She told them, I was the founder and commander of the Gotrov Tower Counter Headquarters. Her words struck them like a sudden blow to the stomach. That was the case until 6 months ago. She recalled dashing across the treacherous mountains of Gotrov, heading towards the spot where the tower had collapsed. The thought of annihilating the tower before it touched the ground, preventing demonic creatures from emerging and ravaging the land, this notion propelled her onward. Her comrades were still out there, running towards that very destination. In an instant, the Empress's eyes transformed. A blend of calmness and deep-seated resentment permeated her being. Adele had experienced hardships throughout their journey across the mountains of Gotrov, yet there was a sense of contentment amidst the exhaustion that threatened to consume her entire being. The sight of the crumbling tower fueled a fire within her. The warm embrace of gratitude from the survivors and the laughter of children adorned with garlands, such vivid memories flooded her mind. And as the carriage swiftly emerged from the arboretum, the opening of her eyes allowed light to pour in, as if awakening from a reverie. Rescue every last person. Never falter. Uphold your humanity and show courtesy. This was the principle Adelaide staunchly advocated when she established the Tower Counter Headquarters, despite her mother's opposition. It embodied Adele's unwavering conviction and served as the guiding purpose for the headquarters. Uphold your humanity and show courtesy. It was a phrase she proudly presented to her mother as well. Did you receive a response? Lionel and Theseus found themselves breathless as they gazed at Adele. Before long, the trio arrived at the communal residence. Your residence is truly splendid, she spoke. Lionel replied, thank you for your kind words. I truly mean it, she spoke. Theseus courteously led the way, with Adele and Lionel flanking him. Adele, in the midst of their walk, suddenly addressed Lionel, Lionel. Theseus returned his gaze to the Empress, surprised by the intimacy with which she addressed him, only to find Lionel looking at her with a natural expression. She asked, are there many books in the residence? He replied, there are quite a number. Many people here have a penchant for collecting books. Unfazed by their peculiar conversation, the Duke paid no mind. The ease with which they walked and conversed seemed so natural that Theseus paused, blinking in disbelief. Whoa, did Her Majesty just call Lionel by his name, while also dropping formal speech with him? They're also being friendly. Do you really plan on becoming her paramour, Lionel Valgier? She continued, oh, then there must be a dedicated library. Lionel replied, would you like to visit the library? She told him, in the Imperial Palace, there is a library I never had the chance to explore due to the circumstances. Could you recommend some books? Lionel suggested, if you let me know your preferences, I can offer recommendations based on my knowledge. Oh, but I suppose we would require permission from the library's owner. Adele came to a halt and located the landlord. Taking a few steps back, she noticed Theseus also stopping, realizing that her actions towards Lionel were now apparent to her Duke. She felt like a miscreant, someone who had played tricks on the cherished children of another household. No, making excuses like, I'm pretending to be Lionel's lover, but it's impossible to suddenly become a lover with someone I don't even know, was simply unjustifiable. Adele was unusually embarrassed. She said, let's talk informally, Duke. Duke Theseus startled. She felt embarrassed when she wanted to suggest, let's talk informally. Her jaw clenched, and she could feel her ears turning red. When had she ever made such a mistake? The Empress, standing silently and blinking, finally looked her age. Theseus understood what was happening when he saw Adele's confused face. The Empress wasn't ignoring or disrespecting their ideas. She was trying to talk about something else. Meanwhile, Lionel laughed behind them. He changed the topic of conversation to help her. The library is on the second floor of the annex. Feel free to make use of it to your heart's content during your stay. Lionel, please guide us. Adele nodded awkwardly and looked at Lionel. He spoke. I'll guide you to the library, Your Majesty. As Lionel led the way, the Empress followed closely behind. Walking at the Empress's pace, Lionel stole glances at her. Where had that imposing figure gone? The one who declared her dominance at the Empress's palace. The Empress's round ears, peeking through her black hair, were flushed crimson. Meanwhile, a few hours earlier at the Ivory Palace, when the Emperor visited the Empress, Lady Giggs was not in the Empress's palace but in the Ivory Palace. She had been tasked with delivering an order from the Empress. Diane, who had personally banished Lady Giggs from the palace 3 years ago, now receives an order from Lady Giggs to depart the palace 3 years later. Therefore, I kindly request that the lady consult with the head of the household and decide whether to remain as a guest in the imperial palace or return to the family as soon as possible. A chuckle resounded through the room, but the elderly lady's face remained unruffled. Diane, who laughed for a while, opened the command sheet and verified it with her own eyes. The Empress's seal, imprinted vividly at the bottom, was as red as blood. Diane spoke. Are you suggesting that I leave the Ivory Palace now? Diane continued. Are you telling me to move out of the Ivory Palace now? Mrs. Giggs' reply. Her Majesty did not say you had to move out immediately. Quote. Diane spoke. It was His Majesty the Emperor who granted me permission to reside in the Ivory Palace. How dare you reverse His Majesty's orders without his consent? Mrs. Giggs' previously indifferent gaze suddenly grew sharp as she stared at Diane. And Spike, how dare you? It is Her Majesty's command. You should show respect at all times, anywhere. Diane muttered. That wretched Empress, Empress, Empress. She said, I will not leave the Ivory Palace unless His Majesty orders me to do so. In response, Mrs. Giggs lifted her gaze once and responded in a businesslike manner. Are you suggesting that you want to rent the entire Ivory Palace? Calculate the daily rental cost of the entire Ivory Palace and send the bill to the Countess of Poitiers. Rent must be paid to the Imperial Palace Finance Office by the end of each month. What? Diane asked. Mrs. Giggs replied, as I mentioned earlier, it is stipulated in the palace law that Her Majesty the Empress holds the authority to make decisions regarding residence in the Imperial Palace. This means that Her Majesty the Empress has the power to retract and reissue orders without seeking consent. So, if you wish to remain in the Ivory Palace as you are now, you must seek approval from Her Majesty the Empress, not His Majesty the Emperor. Diane's face displayed her bewilderment, but Mrs. Giggs pressed further with her composed tone. Her Majesty graciously allowed me time to organize my belongings. We intend to calculate the usage fee starting from the first of the following month, so please ensure the schedule is accurate. Furthermore, the maids of the Ivory Palace will soon be reassigned to other locations. What are you talking about? Diane inquired. Mrs. Giggs continued. Her Majesty also holds the authority to appoint personnel to the Imperial Palace. Diane shouts. What? Mrs. Thought, don't you realize that petty favors hold no value in the face of legitimate authority? Mrs. Giggs turned her body around with unwavering composure. Diane trembled at the chilliness in the air, as if all the blood had drained from her feet. She walked unsteadily from behind her desk, gripping Mrs. Giggs' arm tightly. She spoke. Stop this instant. Relay this to the Empress. She'll definitely regret it if she dares to treat me like this. Does she think the Emperor will just sit by and allow me to be forced out of Ivory Palace? Watching Mrs. Gift's eyes, Diane thought. Those eyes full of contempt. Those eyes that scream, how dare the likes of you? Just like the nobles, I chased this woman out of the royal palace because I hated seeing that look in her eyes. Diane continued, do you think the Emperor will let the Empress trample all over me? He won't. He definitely won't let that happen to me. You know very well the reason why he won't, don't you? Mrs. Giggs then opened her mouth and spoke. Wrinkles had formed around their eyes and mouths. In the time they hadn't seen each other, they would probably increase over time, with a face that had thin skin, prone to wrinkling easily. Lady Giggs leaned toward Diane, whispering into her frozen ear, I know what you're trying to use as a weapon to cling to His Majesty's side. Yes, you certainly resemble her, it reminds me of her. Diane shouts, stop playing with your snake-like tongue. Shut up. Diane tried to escape Lady Giggs's grasp, but the old woman didn't let go so easily. She continued, when did Lady Beatrice pass away? At 29 age. She had a baby face. Indeed, she hasn't had a single wrinkle for such a long time. To His Imperial Majesty, she is forever frozen at 29. An age of beauty that never ages. But for you, at 29, at 30, at 40, time will pass for you, unlike Queen Beatrice. Finally releasing Diane, Lady Giggs took a step back. With a frigid expression on her face, she scrutinized Diane's eyes closely, as if giving advice. Wouldn't it be wise for Her Majesty to summon a skincare specialist with the money intended for sending traders? Shouldn't you prevent wrinkles from appearing? How many young women with blonde hair and blue eyes younger than 29 are there? And how many schemers like you, with hearts just like yours, trying to seize the Emperor's side, are there? I will thoroughly mock your foolishness as you twist the remains of the dead and desperately seek my meager favor. After ruthlessly piercing Diane's heart with her cruel words, Lady Giggs calmly departed from the Ivory Palace. Even after Lady Giggs had left, Diane remained standing in the study, motionless. And after a long while, she slowly turned her head, surveying the study. Sky blue velvet wallpaper, golden moldings, a ceiling adorned with masterpieces, and a dazzling, massive chandelier create a luxurious and beautiful space. Then she muttered, it's mine, it's where I gained and achieved. How much had she cherished this palace? Was there any place in this palace untouched by Diane's touch? Dare you try to expel me from this palace? The more she thought about it, the angrier and more unjust she felt. How dare they try to kick her out of the Ivory Palace just because she bore the name of Empress? How dare they? What did that woman have? What did she possess besides that name? In all the time she had protected the palace by His Majesty's side under the guise of the Empress, this couldn't be reduced to a mere moment. Empress, just with that name, what on earth is that title? The words she spoke to Emperor, Your Majesty, I want to be your one and only wife. Her sincere words were barely whispered after countless hesitations. But it seemed that His Majesty had an answer that wasn't subject to hesitation. As soon as he heard her plea, he replied, No, you cannot. Why? Why was I not enough? She couldn't bring herself to ask for the reasons. Although Lennox prattled on as if he knew everything, it was merely her own thoughts. The Emperor was someone who didn't like to be questioned or probed for reasons. Why wasn't I enough? That insignificant Empress, why couldn't I have the position of Empress, even if it was just in name? She was infuriated. Diane sat down and wept, repeating her words over and over again. That name meant something to me. I wanted to be your rightful wife and the pinnacle of this nation. So why wasn't I enough? Trembling hands opened the vanity, and she took out a mirror, hastily reflecting her own face. Just like Lady Giggs had said, wrinkles had indeed formed around her eyes and mouth. If I cry, they'll deepen even more. Diane gently wiped away the tear stains with a handkerchief and mumbled to herself. Then she quickly called for Lorraine. Summon a skincare specialist right now. Quickly. How many young women with blonde hair and blue eyes younger than 29 are there? Lady Giggs's final words echoed in her ears like a curse. No, it was undoubtedly a curse. Meanwhile, at the Balder mansion, the visit of the Empress was shrouded in secrecy. After a while, his brother made his way towards the library. The butler, informed of the Empress's visit, personally trailed behind the brothers, pushing a cart filled with refreshments. Adele, engrossed in her book, rose from her seat as the trio approached. "Shall we have a bite to eat?" Lionel suggested. "Thank you, but the library is splendid," Adele replied. "Is it to your liking?" Lionel inquired. Adele's response: "It was wonderful." She continued, "Now, ask me your questions," the Empress said directly as she settled into her seat. Being in close proximity to a nation's ruler, she had no need for superfluous conversation. Yet, it was astonishing that the atmosphere remained unassuming. Just as Theseus had noticed during their wedding, the Empress possessed a remarkable ability to command her entourage with gentle words and actions. As Theseus observed the Empress, Lionel initiated the questioning, "May I inquire about the tower's destruction?" Lionel began, seizing the opportunity that had been pent up within him until now. Adele nodded, granting permission for him to proceed. Lionel had been eagerly waiting for this chance to satisfy his curiosity. "On that day, you mentioned that it was level 4, close to level 5, so there's no time to waste. Can you personally dismantle a tower of level 4 or lower?" In response to the query, Adele furrowed her brow slightly and shook her head. "I can handle a tower below level 5 on my own. With level 4 towers, I can demolish the lower and middle sections, but the upper levels are beyond my reach alone. However, if possible, I avoid destroying them single-handedly." "You destroyed the towers before they even touched the ground. Is that the usual approach in Gotrov?" Lionel probed. Adele continued, "It happened by chance around 5 years ago. Since then, the foremost rule of tower destruction is to dismantle them before they make contact with the ground." Lionel spoke. "The extent of the damage is incomparable." Adele continued, "The issue is that there are very few wizards who can ride the updraft like I can, so statistically, about half of the year, we manage to dismantle them before they hit the ground, while for the rest, we have no choice but to destroy them as they fall." Lionel said, "You remember that day, don't you? When we dismantle them before they touch the ground, there is no loss of life unless the striker makes the unfortunate mistake of falling. As a general rule, any tower that makes contact with the ground must be dismantled within a 2-day period. Nearby wizards bear the responsibility of demolishing the tower, and if the assigned wizards are insufficient, the next unit of wizards must swiftly take action." Theseus, who had been attentively listening, posed a question in a hushed voice. "What are your thoughts on leaving the tower standing? Can it be managed?" Upon hearing the question, Adele's expression hardened, and she responded with firm resolve, "Absolutely not." She asked, "How does Gotrov handle towers that touch the ground? And, what do you mean by management?" Lionel stood up and spoke. "Her Majesty, please excuse us, we want to show you something." Theseus spread the Egmont map across a spacious table. Adele peered down at it, while Lionel proceeded to place crimson stones across the map. In an instant, dozens of stones adorned its surface. Even after depleting one handful of red stones, Lionel reached for another. Adele's countenance grew increasingly somber with each passing moment. When Lionel finally removed his hand from the map, the Empress appeared almost breathless, her gaze fixed on the sight before her. The translucent red stones gleamed and cast shadows, as if drenching the entire map in a macabre crimson hue. She asks. Are you saying all these red stones represent towers? Our manhwa ends here, friends. But do you want some spoiler? If yes, then keep watching this video, otherwise you may skip the reason why Diane isn't pregnant. We all have this question, so let me kill your curiosity. It's because the Emperor, he didn't want any child. He only want child from the Empress. Because of his bad childhood memories, he always wants to get recognized from former Empress. But because he was illegitimate child, former Empress didn't love him. He always wish her to be his real mother, instead of his half-sane mother. That's why he secretly gives Diane drugs so that she can't bear his child anyhow.